Hey everyone. So I am hopping on today to kind of give like a follow-up from last night's live. So if you didn't see that, it was kind of a word for anyone who's struggling. And I talked about in the beginning how I had a very specific thing I was going to say, and then the Lord kind of derailed it and took it in a different direction. And today I feel like he wants me to kind of give the follow-up to what I was originally going to say. Almost like permission, like, okay, now you can share it. Now you're good. So it's actually a little different than what I've normally done. I actually want to go through kind of like a mini Bible study. Hopefully it's easy to follow and we'll get through some really good points. But the reason why I wanted to share this is because last night, we talked a lot about people who are struggling, and that struggling doesn't just happen for those who are down and out, who appear to have tensions and turmoil in their life, but it goes across the board for every single person. And the Lord has really been not wrecking me, but pressing on my heart with a specific word to face it and to deal with it. And if you've been following anything on my Facebook, the Lord's taken me through Genesis in the month of January and really unpacked some of these people's stories and understand it in a different type of way. And so I was actually going through, I think it was about a week and a half ago, and I met Sarah and Abraham. Not for the first time, but I got reacquainted with them. And so I'm reading through Sarah's story, and really her life was just standing out to me more than ever. And I'm watching her behavior, and I'm watching her interact with other people and those around her, and I'm just thinking in my head, like, Sarah, what is your deal? I mean, she was behaving in ways that I'm like, you're being mean, you're being, you're not believing God, like, what is going on with you? And her story really started to impact me, and I hit this one point in her story, which we'll touch in a little bit. I'm reading it, and it stands out to me, and I'm like, girl, what is going on with you? Why are you acting like this? And so I'm reading her story, and again, if you're following on my Facebook, you know that I'm reading a Brene Brown book right now. And her stuff is just so good that I read her book, and what she was talking about was literally exactly what Sarah was going through. And so today I want to talk about this one word that we all face and that may be ruling our stories much more than we realize, and specifically our belief system and our relationships. And, a week and a half ago, on a Sunday, I was reading the word, and the Lord unpacked Sarah's story for me and then unpacked this principle, and it made me realize how much it was ruling my story and how I was living out of that place. And that one word, dare I even say it, but it's shame. And it's really hard for us to face, and I think so many of us don't actually deal with shame in our lives. And, even Brene talks about it in her book, that we often, flee from it, and we don't want to deal with it because it can cause such shame. We don't want to face it. We don't want to deal with it. So I want to go through Sarah's story because I can see these behaviors in her life that I don't think a lot of us realize we're living in, and that the root is shame. And so I want to help us to understand that, because I know I was personally impacted so much by this, and I started realizing how much shame actually played into my story. And the thing is that we can't defeat things we can't defeat a battle if we don't know the battle is actually happening within us. And that's why we have to become aware of these things in our own lives and what's going on underneath the surface. And so I want to start off with this. We go to the beginning of Sarah's story. The beginning of her story, when it talks about her child, being childless, is Genesis 11, and it's verse 30. And we read that last night, where it says, now Sarah was childless because she was not able to conceive. And then, yesterday we talked about how she's a very beautiful woman. It goes beyond just our looks, but a lot of people who are hurting the most are the ones who look like they have everything together. But it's interesting because it says she's childless because she's not able to conceive. And when we look at shame, the root of shame is believing that we are unworthy or flawed, and therefore we don't belong. And so it causes us to disconnect. And what's interesting is that, we understand that as believers, is that, shame is really this belief that not only that God can't cover our flaws, but we focus on that and we fixate on that. And I think really that's the heart of Sarah's story, is that she truly believed as a woman that she was flawed. that she had something wrong with her. And I don't know if you guys have ever been there before, where you honestly feel like maybe it's not being able to have children, but there's something else in your life where a mistake has defined you, or a traumatic circumstance that happened to you has defined you and labeled you. And we take these things on as our identity, and we truly believe that we are then unworthy to be accepted, to be loved, or to belong. I don't know if anyone has found themselves there, but I started realizing even a week and a half ago how much that belief really was like in my heart, that I thought at some level that I was flawed and there was something wrong with me. And because of that, I was ashamed, and it caused me to react in my life. And so when we look at Sarah's story, that is the root. We have to understand that that's the root of her entire story, why she acts the way that she does, because she believed that as a woman, she was flawed and unworthy. And so we watch her story unfold, and I've got a lot of notes here, as you can see. So hopefully we'll make this as clear and concise as possible. But I won't go through all of them because I just want to give you the highlights of her story. But essentially what happens, and you'll find this later in chapter 16, is that Sarah then takes it in her own hands to have a child. And she is, an older woman, doesn't think that God can actually come through for her and deliver a child. And so she takes it in her own hands and has their servant, Hagar, essentially, sleep with Abraham to have a child. And she actually says to Abraham, go sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can build a family through her. And so she takes it in her own hands. They get pregnant, Hagar and Abraham. And when they get pregnant, when Hagar finds that out, she starts to despise Sarah. And so you already see this rift, this tension building with them. And so it goes on in that same chapter, and it says, when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to despise her mistress. And then Sarah said to Abraham, you are responsible for the wrong I am suffering. And then she goes on and says, I put my servant in your arms, and now that she knows she's pregnant, she despises me. May the Lord judge between you and me. Now it's interesting because I'm already connecting with Sarah's story, because she is blame shifting like no other. And out of her own pain of trying to make something happen, and then she makes this mistake, Hagar gets pregnant, and all of a sudden there's this rift, this tension building, and it's all rooted out of shame, out of her belief that she's flawed, that now she's blame shifting and saying it's Abraham's fault. I don't know if you guys have ever been there, where you're like, it's your fault that I am the way that I am. It's your fault that I now have tension between Hagar and I. And it's literally causing this divide in their family structure, in their home. So she blame shifts. She says, it's your fault, Abraham. And then Abraham, as a man who's he's trying to make his wife happy. He says, you do whatever you want with her. And then it says, so Sarah mistreated Hagar, so much so that she fled from her. The word Hagar, the name actually means flight. And I don't know if it's because of this specific scenario, if God thought that would be, a good connection, but Hagar flees because she is so wrongly treated by Sarah. And again, we see that Sarah, the root of her shame, the root of what she's going through, causes her to make a mistake, to take things in her own hands, to then blame Abraham for her problems, and then to be so nasty and cruel to her servant that the servant would run away. And if that isn't convicting, if that doesn't enlighten our own lives, I don't know what does. Because a lot of times I think that we believe that shame will just stay where it is. It'll just stay in my gut and it won't come out. It's not going to impact anybody. My shame is hidden. I'm just going to, go hide and no one will know. But what I'm coming to realize even more and more than I already understood about shame was that shame has a voice, shame has an emotion, and shame has behavior. And a lot of times we are acting out of this place of feeling like we are so unworthy, we are so flawed, that we will attack other people. We will be angry or vicious towards one another. And we act out of that place. And I've seen that all over the place, where we could be in school, we can be in a classroom, and someone is just nasty and cruel to us, or we're nasty and cruel to other people. And so many times it comes from this place of being hurt. Hurt people. And Sarah is living that, where she's just mistreating those around her. And it's really, really sad. So then we go on and, God meets Abraham, he meets Sarah, and he says, you're going to have a child. Around this time next year, you're going to have a child. And with that, right after that, Sarah laughs. And she's kind of by herself. She thinks, okay, they're not here, they're not hearing. And she laughs to herself and she says, at my age, you think I'm going to have a child? And God calls her out on it. And he's like, you laughed. And she's like, no, I didn't laugh. And he's like, yeah, you did. I know, I'm God. I know you laughed. And so it's interesting in that scenario that we have Sarah who laughs. Now, what's interesting is that Sarah laughs and Abraham laughs, both at the promise of God, but they're completely different laughters. Sarah is laughing, almost like scoffing or mocking in a way, God's word. And he's saying, I'm going to deliver you a child. And she's like, that laughter, like that sarcastic laughter, almost like, really? Laughing in doubt, laughing out of fear. Maybe she's laughing because she wants it to be true, but she doesn't have the hope that it could be true. I don't know if anyone's been there before, where your hope is literally so diminished that you don't even know how to look forward to the promise of God. She's there, where she's literally laughing at God for his word. And then beyond that, God calls her out of it, almost like to say, I see you, like I know what's going on here. And she lies. She lies to cover it up. This is just like conviction after conviction after conviction, or really connection after connection, where the Lord is like hitting these things within our own lives and what shame does, because then we see she's blame shifting, she's mistreating so much that people would leave. She laughs at God and then she lies to cover it up. She lies in order to cover up her own disbelief, her own unbelief in God. I don't know if this is hitting anybody, but I'm reading her story and I'm like, this is so crazy. Like, even to think now that we do these things to cover up our shame. So then we see it goes on. God actually makes a way. So he gets Sarah pregnant. She has this child. They name him Isaac, means he laughs. And then Sarah says that she's laughing in joy. I think this is chapter 21. So Sarah says, God brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. And this is really interesting because you think that there's hope, right? That you're like, yes, Sarah's getting it. She's seeing that she's not flawed. She's seeing that God can work beyond the way that her body is, that she thinks her body is wrong or her body is tainted or whatever. Like, God is literally showing up and doing a miracle here. Maybe she's going to get it. Maybe she's going to believe God. And she says, okay, God is bringing me laughter, which in this case, it's joy. It's rejoicing at how good God is. It's rejoicing at the miracle. It's finally seeing this promise fulfilled after, I think it was 25 years of waiting, and she's 90 years old at this time. And then she says, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Like, she's inviting other people in to see the miracle that has happened, and she wants that. Like, she wants other people to come along and see her life and see how good God is. And so we get this momentary hope that she's changed and that she's healed, right? But unfortunately, we see right after that, in the next paragraph, her interaction with Hagar. And so it says, the child grew, which is Isaac, and was weaned. And on the day Isaac was weaned, Abraham held a great feast. But Sarah saw that the son whom Hagar the Egyptian had borne to Abram was mocking. And she said to Abraham, get rid of that slave woman and her son, for that slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son, Isaac. Now, I find this super interesting because it just goes right along with Brené's book when she's unpacking statistically and through these stories, shame. And at the heart of it, shame disconnects us from other people. And that's really what the enemy loves to do. He loves to disconnect us and create isolation where we wouldn't rely on one another to heal or to find help or guidance or support. And so we see that in two specific ways in this verse, in these couple of verses. And the first is that she actually says, get rid of that slave woman and her son. And what's interesting is that she's disconnecting from them so much that she wouldn't even use their names. And I think that we all do this from time to time. I don't know if you guys have ever done this, where maybe you're like so angry at your mother-in-law, and I love my mother-in-law. I'm just using an example, Sandy. I love you. But you're so mad at your mother-in-law, or you're so mad at your neighbor or your boss or your coworker that you don't even use their name. You literally say, that woman, that man, and we disconnect from the relationship that's already been established. And I find that in this verse, Sarah is doing that exact thing. Ishmael is mocking her. He's mocking the scenario of her son, her promise from God. And Sarah, I think it's like this awakening of realizing how foolish she was and the mistake that she made, that she doesn't even want anything to do with it. So she entirely disconnects from the situation and says to them, not even Hagar, not even Ishmael, her husband's son and her husband's son's mother, who she has close relationship with, she says, get that slave woman out. Get that boy out. And that is so often what we do in our own lives. And that's all shame talking. It's all shame. Sarah is so ashamed of what she's created in her own family and the fact that now her mistake would be mocking her, that she can't deal with it, and she disconnects from the relationship. But the other part of that is that she says, the slave woman's son will never share in the inheritance with my son Isaac. At this point, we see that Sarah is, I think she's just plagued with turmoil. Like, I think she just has that tension going on inside of her where I think she's just really confused and she sees the mess that she's made because she literally contradicts herself. Because if you remember in the very beginning, in chapter, 13, I think? One of those chapters. She says, I'm going to build a family, and I'm going to build a family through this son, through whoever, she doesn't know who it is, whoever Hagar produces, we're going to produce, and we're going to build our family through her. But in these moments, she says, out of shame, out of her own realizing of her foolishness, she says, he will never share in the inheritance with my son. So again, we see Sarah's doubt say, you will have nothing to do with my family. And see, it's interesting because I think that shame so many times has such a hold in our lives that our heart's desire, really, like Sarah says, is that everyone who hears about my story will laugh with me, will find joy with me. But shame was so deeply rooted in her lifestyle and her beliefs that she still couldn't act out of that deep desire that people would laugh with her, where then she would act out of shame instead of God's goodness to cast people away and say, you will have nothing to do with my story. You will have nothing to do with what I am walking through right now, the promises of God. And so I'm reading her story, and it's convicting, but it's eye-opening to see, wow, I do that too. You know, do we blame shift? Do we blame other people for our problems? Do we despise other people? Do we mistreat, and are we nasty and cruel to other people because of our own shame and believing that we're truly flawed and we're unworthy? Are we laughing at God and his promises in such doubt that he'll actually come through? Are we lying to God then to try to cover up the mistakes that we make? And this is a cycle of shame. But then next to that, we see Abraham. And now he's not a perfect man because obviously he goes along with things that, you know, Sarah's ideas and that kind of thing. And I don't really know where God's opinion is on all of that, but it'll be interesting, you know, if I pray about it more, see what God says. But it's interesting because we see Abraham's story and it's quite different than Sarah's. And I think so much of it is based on these couple of principles that I found. The first is that God encounters Abraham to speak truth and promise to him throughout Abraham's entire life. And so we see a lot of times that Abraham has a much more intimate walk with the Lord than Sarah does. There's many more encounters that he has with the Lord than Sarah has. And so we see specifically in, 11? In chapter 11. Is that right? No. Hold on. 15. Chapter 15, God comes to Abraham and he affirms him. He says, do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield and your very great reward. And then he goes on to tell him about all of the promise that he has, how he's going to have multiple descendants, that they're going to be so many that he won't be able to count them, so on and so forth. And then in verse 6, it says, Abraham believed the Lord and he credited to him as righteousness. And what we find next to Sarah is Sarah believes in her flaws and her unworthiness more than God. But Abraham believes in God's faithfulness above his flaws. And so that's really the question for you is, where do you find yourself at? Maybe on a daily basis or maybe right now. Are you believing in the flaws more than the faithfulness of God? And what we find in this story is that God is faithful through our flaws. But it's up to us to choose what we focus on. And for Sarah, her focusing on those flaws and her unworthiness would cause a series of reactions that would cause a lot of distress and chaos in her family. And Abraham continually believed God, continually believed in God's faithfulness, even though he couldn't see it happening. And he didn't turn inward to think, I am flawed, I am unworthy, I don't see why my body isn't working either. I mean, he was just as much part of that problem with Sarah as Sarah was going through. And so we just see that he focuses on God first and foremost. Then we go on and we see the scenario of laughter. And so Abraham laughs with God. Sarah laughs at him and then lies. And Abraham, when he hears the promises of God, he actually laughs with him in rejoicing. And he actually falls on his face. And he is essentially surrendering to the Lord. And so it's interesting because if you want to have like a play on words, Sarah laughs and lies, and Abraham laughs and lies. But his laughter is affirming with God that I'm believing for this too. And I'm going to lie down in surrender. I'm going to lie down, face down, knowing that I don't know how this is going to happen. I don't know how you're going to redeem all this situation in my life, but I'm trusting that you have it. And I'm going to surrender my own fears, my own doubts to your will. And I think that's really powerful. So I would ask you, where do you find yourself? Where do you find yourself more laughing at God and then lying to cover it up? Or are you laughing at God, or are you laughing with God, knowing that he's going to fulfill your promise? And then are you lying down in surrender of what you think, what you believe, and your fears, to say yes to his will? And the last thing is that, and this is really not the most powerful thing, but I feel like this really is the hinge piece for it all, for finding our healing out of shame. And it goes back to the scenario of the great celebration. And so Sarah, Ishmael is mocking the whole situation, and Sarah gets so frustrated that she sends them away. And what's interesting is that Abraham allows it to happen. But Abraham has compassion in the situation. And he actually goes along, he provides food and water for them as they leave. And he's really distressed about the situation. Obviously, it's his son, and he's really upset. But what's interesting is that a chapter before that, Abraham is describing his own story, and he says, the Lord essentially made me wander through the desert. And in that very same way, when Hagar is talked about how she's going to go, she's sent away, it says she went on her way and she wandered in the desert. And that word is the same word. And so I think really at the heart of it is that Abraham had a compassion for Hagar that Sarah didn't have. And he had that compassion because he knew what it felt like to be a wanderer. He knew what it felt like to be sent on a way, not knowing where the destination was, not knowing what was going to be happening next, where his next meal would be. And that was a step of obedience for him to step out into the wilderness to follow God's command. But he still knew what it felt like to be a wanderer, to feel aimless and not know where he would lie his head at night, and especially to take his entire family with him. And so I think that's really the hinge piece for our healing process out of shame, is that we would have compassion because of our story to connect with other people. And shame will often tell us that we should disconnect from people, we should isolate ourselves, and we should act out of these defense mechanisms to protect ourselves, to keep ourselves in our little barricaded safe space. But compassion and empathy helps us to reconnect with people and to really bless us both, to bless both parties with healing and with grace. And, Abraham went through just as much as Sarah did. And he had the choice, encouraged to say, I know what it feels like to be sent away and to wander through a desert. And because of that, I'm going to have compassion with you, and I'm not going to be angry. And he could have done the same thing as Sarah. He could have said, you are a reminder of my mistake. You are a reminder of what we went through before the miracle, and we got to get rid of you. And he could have done that. He could have acted like that, but he didn't. He acted in compassion and with grace instead, to empathize with her in her story. And so the last thing I want to tell you real quick is that throughout this story, throughout Sarah's, I don't want to call it a situation, but throughout her life and these mistakes that she's making and her behavior, God is so active. And these key verses stood out to me, and God literally is moving on behalf of, but he's moving in the midst of their mistakes. And it actually says that God sees, and he meets Hagar in the very beginning in the wilderness when she runs away, and she says, God sees me. This is the one who sees me. And then he goes on even further, and God speaks up and he says, I hear the cries of what's happening. And then even further, he meets Hagar again at the very end when she is wandering in the desert and she's got no food, no water. She's completely disheartened. And the Lord comes to her and says, open your eyes. And she sees a well. And so I want to encourage us today that no matter what voice or emotion or behavior shame has had in your life, God sees, God hears, and God ultimately will open your eyes to solutions. And he'll open your eyes to healing. And really the solution for us is, like I talked about last night, is to reconnect like Abraham did to the promise of God and what God says above anything else, to believe in his faithfulness rather than our flaws, and to cast our eyes on him, and then to affirm and to step out in compassion, because our story, we connect with it in a way that gives us an ability to connect with other people. We don't hide from it, and we don't allow it to rule us in anger or frustration or gossip or slander of one another. And so I hope, this is, like I said, it's kind of long. I hope that it blessed you in some way. But this is really where I've been at, is unpacking this idea of shame through Scripture. And I think that ultimately the Lord is calling us to face our inner demons and to face the shame that we feel and the elements where we feel flawed or we feel unworthy, to show us that through him, through the blood of Christ, we are worthy. Not because of who we are as humanity, as a broken or a tainted humanity, if you want to say that, but because we are covered in the blood of Christ, and because our identity is now a royal priesthood. And we are called and we are chosen by him to live a life of fullness and abundance. And really, when we grab hold of that, that's when healing comes. And that's when we're able then to act out of that place of laughter and to invite other people in to say, look at what God did. And so if this blessed you in any way, I would love to hear about it. At this point, I feel like it's a lot of rambling. But I know it's really good. It really has impacted me. So if this blessed you, I would encourage you to share this. I would encourage you to tag a friend maybe who this could bless. Maybe they're dealing with a lot of shame. And I would love to hear where you're at. If Sarah if her story has impacted you, you don't have to get deep, because I know this is really deep stuff. But even if you want to just give like a thumbs up and say, this really blessed me. This has really hit me exactly where I'm at. And just know that God hears, God sees, and God will redeem everything that you've walked through, and he will show you how you can believe his promises, you can believe his faithfulness above any of the flaws that you may be focusing on right now. And so I love you guys. I'm so thankful that you allow me to spend some time with you, especially on a Friday. So I hope you have a great weekend, and I love you guys, and we'll talk soon. Bye.